My name is Elizabeth Friedman. I am an environmental physician, and that's the least important part of this talk today. I'm so excited to be here to present these fabulous panelists through the Science Community Action Network, which we'll tell you more about later. Our first presenter is Beto Lugo Martinez. He's an environmental justice organizer and shares a leadership co-executive director role at his current organization. He aims to raise community voices in the fight against environmental racism and to overcome systemic exclusion of frontline communities from the decision-making process. His lived experience growing up at the fence line to petrochemical facility continues to drive his work at the intersection of environmental justice, climate, and public health. He's a founding member of the California Environmental Justice Coalition and a member of several national climate and environmental justice networks, including EJ Leadership Forum, the Moving Forward Network, B, or otherwise known as Building Equity and Alignment. His contributions to the movement include organizing climate policy that, again, prioritizes environmental justice and community-led research, among other community-engaged initiatives. Beto has co-authored several academic publications on community-based participatory research, air pollution, data accessibility, community engagement, and has presented his work at multiple NIEHS core centers. He also serves on the advisory board for APHA's Center for Climate Health and Equity, as well as an advisory board member for HEI, Health Effects Institute, and continues to serve in the Southern California Center for Children's Environmental Health Sciences, Translational Research, and the Advisory Board for Community Engagement Core at the Southern California Environmental Health Sciences Center at USC, and the list goes on and on. And recently he was invited to serve on the Federal Clean Air Act Advisory Committee as well to represent grassroots frontline perspectives. I'm going to stop there.
All right, so let's get started here. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the introduction. So the title of my presentation, talking about the historical harms of ignoring environmental justice communities. And growing up at the fence line means literally growing up at the fence line of pollution sources, petrochemical facilities. A lot of our communities, brown and black, indigenous nations, are at the fence line of a lot of this injustice and racism, right? It's all interconnected. We want to make sure that we don't lose that because when it comes to public health, we want to ensure that we move in the direction that public healthers are intentional and how is it that they support communities on the ground. Because we, on our own, have been able to move policies forward. We don't wait for a policymaker. We don't wait for a public healther. We move with our own data, with our own lived experience, and drive the science forward. But I want to start with this slide, talking about life at the fence line. And this is an important slide to me, and I've thought about been using it more recently because this is really where I come from, right? And it's important to remember that because a lot of us come from a place like this. You know, I grew up, this is my mother in 1988, right? A petrochemical facility right behind me. And I'm going to talk about the greenwashing too of the fossil fuel industry. So this company was called PureGrow, but it's a Chevron, so already it's a greenwash name. However, we moved there because of practices and policies of government policies and practices that are racist, right? That intentionally put my family, my siblings, my parents in harm's way. We needed a place to live. We were excited that, you know what, my parents, first-time homeowners, we're going to have a home, but never realizing the dangers that the government put us, USDA and HUD, those kind of programs. And I also want to add that, this is 1988. I wasn't in high school yet, but this facility's there. That was our playground. That was the neighborhood's playground. That has caused so many problems to our community. This is 2020, monitoring, after this place was demolished, and I'll show you the next slide where we organized, we fought for this space to be shut down, and we finally got it shut down in 2020. It took a long time, and now it's 2023, and the cleanup has just begun. Why did the cleanup just begin? Because we also pushed for land use and zoning policies that can protect our community. We didn't want to just say, okay, they just shut it down, and then clean it up however you want. We wanted to ensure there was a very engaged process, a community-led process, that they informed what they wanted in the neighborhood. We wanted residential zoning. We didn't get it. We fought and fought and fought. We got it down to light commercial, so that's what's happening right now. But we can always go back and change it because we don't stop. We're there now. But the thing, what I want to highlight is that now, it was demolished, but now that they come back to clean up the space, clean up the hazardous waste, and transport it to an indigenous nation, we have to take care of our allies. We have to take care of them as well and ensure that the harm is not put on another community. So there's that continued advocacy, that continued organizing that we have to be part of, because we're not here to displace anyone else, just like our government and racist public health departments have done in our communities, right? And so this is very important to me. That's my mother and that's my father. In 2020, they started doing fenceline monitoring ahead of thinking, how is it that they were gonna, when they did the cleanup, what kind of releases we're having. We didn't need any monitoring. We already know. We are that filter. We are the ones that absorbs all this pollution. And so this is, again, now you see the background. That facility is gone. But we were organizing to ensure, because of the Department of Toxics in California wanted to say, oh, we want to clean it. We have a plan for you all. No, we pushed back hard. We said, no, that's not what we want. And, what I mentioned earlier, that we were able to finally get it to this light commercial, and it's a cleanup right now. And we're still protesting, even though we got it to shut down way back. We're protesting because that's what we wanted. And we had the news come out here and in Spanish cover it, because also our community is primarily Spanish. It was a newscast that's just primarily English. We told, no, we need to do this in Spanish, because our community, our parents, everyone was primarily Spanish speaking. But now I'm going to go way off. Not way off, because it's still Chevron, and it's still those polluters, and it's still the fossil fuel racist industry that fuels our public health systems, that fuels our universities, our academic institutions, right? And I wanted to start here because, I know that this is something that we see when you get on that plane to come to this conference. You see somewhere in there, pay a carbon offset for your trip, right? Or here, carbon neutral, buy this or pay this, right? And so really want to highlight this, because when we think about the impacts it has in our communities locally and abroad, in the global south, for indigenous nations, in forests, in other parts of the world, this is what's happening here. Net zero, so you see this slide here, that net zero, I'll just read this. In the face of the undeniably changing climate, the fossil fuel industry and other high emissions industries, as well as banks, financiers, and other actors who prop them up, have had to invent new tactics. And this is why we're having this conversation today. We have to put up against these tactics. We don't want them, but this is what they're doing. They have shifted and ignoring climate change and its impacts. And I don't want anyone to think that, oh, they're the saviors, because that's what they're doing now. They're saying we have the solution, where they're the ones that cause it. They are the ones that cause the harm, and now they say they can fix it. And time again, and I'll get to that later, when we're fighting to ban fracking as well. So presenting themselves as saviors, claiming to provide the world with magical fixes to the crisis they have caused. Net zero, carbon market, carbon offsets, and removal, and now saying nature-based solutions, saying that they can do this by planting a tree somewhere 1 million miles from here, and say we're claiming, credits, okay? So this is what we talk about, false solutions to the climate crisis and the impact it has to our health. And I want to talk about the cap and trade harms as well. So cap and trade is a system, right, where the polluter can pay, or a cap, there's a cap, or they can pay or trade that credit and give it to someone else so they can pollute more. So again, it's shifting the pollution and causing harm in our communities. And we've seen it the first time, the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2008, California. This is what they promised. 2012, they did this, the extension, and we're saying no more. We don't want this, because we've seen the environmental how this perpetuates environmental racism. And so just want to share a little bit about the cap and trade, the offsets. It's all connected, right? It's just a scheme from the fossil fuel industry. And then the impacts it continues to have on our health. So I want to just share this briefly too, because these are some of those proposed false solutions, right, to the climate crisis. Carbon capture, we'll hear more about. net zero, as I mentioned, direct air capture, hydrogen, nuclear energy, nature-based solutions. All these things here are part of those fall solutions, right? And so it's important to think about this when you, as public healthers, want to partner with communities and say, we know what you need. We need to make sure that you being intentional and knowing that the communities speak for themselves and they can say, this is what we want. If they don't want it, and the process and the thing that's happening right now with a lot of these false solutions is that there's no public process, no community engagement. And when I talk about community engagement, I'm not saying inviting agencies to a community engagement, because that's what they do. Public healthers say community engagement, and who's there? Agencies. That's not the community. Community are people with real life experiences, real life harms and trauma, historical trauma. And so, this, yeah, okay, I'll go to the next thing. And so I want to share this just to give you like a snapshot about what we mean about net zero and carbon neutral. I think this slide here puts it pretty well, because when you think about reducing emissions, this is, if you follow that diagram here, yes, you'll store it, it'll move, but then there comes the oil rig, because now what's being proposed that a lot of these existing wells are going to be used to extract more oil. You're going to pump the carbon dioxide in there, and then they're going to push, and at the end, it's still going to be used again. So it's not cutting emissions. You're not reducing the emissions. You're perpetuating that. If you see the slides here, you cannot do both. You cannot say you're going to reduce them and then release them to other for other uses like transportation or heating or other practices. So if you read the slide, you can see there how this perpetuates that the enhanced oil recovery. That's what they use to get more oil out of the ground. And they did it, they were doing fracking, right? Several years, they're still doing fracking. They said, we're going to come back and get back into that bedrock and pull more oil out of there in the same communities that have been harmed. So this is just another image around net zero or carbon neutral, which all cities across the country are like, oh, we're net zero by 2050, climate action plans with no environmental justice guidance, no plans to improve public health. None of that is centered in these plans. We contributed to a plan at one of the cities, and there was no mention of that. And even their GHG inventory was flawed. And, I might, Elizabeth said, I participate here, participate there. I might not have a degree, but my lived experience tells me I need to be involved in all of this. This is why I do this, right? Because we need to know everything. And so when you come at me as an academic or a university, guess what? I'll go toe-to-toe with you, because I know the lived experience. I know how I've been harmed. I showed that picture in the beginning. My family is still harmed by it. And when you think about the impacts, right? I'd like to show this slide just real briefly, because you all might have heard PM 2.5, but that's not what we're breathing. We're breathing particles that there's no health standard for. We're breathing stuff that is not monitored, that is not being regulated by any agency. And now they want to fix the climate crisis with these technologies when there's no enforcement regulatory agency involved. And I'll let my colleagues talk more about that in a little bit. But this is what we're breathing right here on this screen. What goes into our body and our bloodstream, and why we die 22, 29, 30 years sooner than other neighborhoods, than white affluent neighborhoods. This is just another screen of the impacts to public health, right? From the extraction, from all of it, right? The carbon economy increases health disparities and fuels the climate crisis. And this is just an image for you all, just to, I don't know, what time is it? Okay. Yeah, just wanted to show that. And as public healthers, I would think that you all would know what are the impacts of oil and gas extraction. I would think that, but I don't know if you really know. I'm going to be honest. So I want to use this slide because when we think about, carbon sequestration and hydrogen and all these new technocratic fixes to the climate crisis, and we think about, oh, well, it's going to be capped, it's going to be stored. No, there's nothing that you can contain. When it comes to the fossil fuel industry, you can't contain anything. You cannot say that it's going to be contained, because it's going to be put out there either in a product or emissions, but you're still going to continue to be exposed or experience harm from it. And so I want to share this slide because this slide is Aliso Canyon in California, and Porter Ranch in California, very affluent part of California in San Fernando Valley. And 100 metric tons, and as you can see the black spot here with the plume. And this is the amount of time it took, October 23, 2015 through February 28, 2016. That's how long that plume was in that community. But guess what? They mobilized. This was an affluent community, very affluent, and the governor put millions of dollars to say, hey, go take care of them, put everyone in a hotel. But guess what? The communities living 30 miles away from there in East Los Angeles didn't have the same respect, didn't have the same response or the same adequate response from anyone. You know, you continue, you're brown, you're black, you keep dying, you keep getting poisoned. And here it is. And now I just realized in August 23, they again said, now we're going to go back and allow this place to continue. So this is the harm that perpetuates environmental racism day in, day out. They're going back, and I'm not saying like, okay, you go back to San Fernando. I'm not saying just go and pollute there because it's affluent community. But what I'm saying, they find a way to always come back and do more harm. And this is what I was trying to get at. Why does affluent Porter Ranch get more urgent environmental relief than working class Boyle Heights? And it's time to treat East LA with the same urgency. And that wasn't what was happening at that time. And it's not happening now either. And this was a settlement, right? This is a settlement. And this part of the false solution that I want to share also is part of all of this, because they were fined, and the settlement was at $119.5 million. Okay? But the SoCal Gas got creative and said, well, wait a minute, we got to figure out the settlement. And I know how settlements work in EPA in California and how they like pay $5 instead of $115 or $119, being exaggerated. But you know, the crime doesn't ever fit the violation, the money or the fine or the violation. It never matches the environmental crime. But yes, us as black and brown indigenous, our crime, we're locked up. You know, we can get locked up for having a failing smog test in our car, because they're going to say, well, you don't have your license or you don't have this. But these are the polluters, people dumping on us. And so what they did through this mitigation process, you know, they got the settlement, but, you know, they went back to court. It was a mitigation process. And they said, wow, you know, what we can do is now let's go construct methane biodigesters in the Central Valley and continue to pull that natural, use methane and gas for more electricity. And guess who lives in those areas? Again, brown and black communities that are being harmed. Okay, so I just want to make sure that you hear it loud and clear. Our brown and black communities need to be respected, and we need public healthers to be at the forefront and be there with us in solidarity and standing with us. Actually, not just standing, but letting us lead, but supporting us in this, because this is monumental for a lot of communities. But you all are in a place where you can support us, and you can also be part of that to advance that, right? So CCS, I know how many minutes do I have? 5? Okay, cool. All right, so carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So I'll just share this slide real quickly, but I'll let my colleagues talk more about this in a few minutes. But again, you know, it's using the CCS techno fixes to burn more billions of dollars, you know, putting it elsewhere instead of improving or giving money back to our communities that need investment. And a lot of this has also come up through Justice 40, which is also an initiative that says this prioritize environmental justice communities, which I would also think maybe one of our colleagues who's part of that WEJAC, part of informing the White House EJ Council on the Justice 40 investments and all that, can talk more about this. But I did want to just share that, you know, this is what I talk about. There's no engagement with the community at all at the moment. Not to the extent that, yeah, there isn't. Just gonna leave it there. There isn't, you know, there isn't that engagement yet. So I did want to share this again, because when we think about how do we store carbon, if you look at this slide, there is no way that you're going to keep it on the ground. We want to keep it all on the ground. And if you see this full life cycle with carbon removal, is like there's direct air capture, there is these point sources, there's sequestration, but it's still, at the end, it's still going to be out here. So when we talk about carbon neutral, carbon emissions, and reducing with these technocratic fixes, we know it's not going to work. I know it's not going to work. We all know it's not going to work on this panel, right? We know because we've seen it, we've done the research, the analysis, and they have the analysis to prove that, this is not going to work. I also want to talk about, when you think about those emissions, when we think about living at the fence line of industry and pollution sources, and the term that we use a lot, fugitive emissions or emission releases, like this one. This site here was at a carbon capture place. You can't contain it. I mean, it has to find a way out of a system of pipe leaks out of anywhere. This is an event that happened in Mississippi, where it just stopped the whole a community. It mobilized the community because it depletes the oxygen. There were vehicles moving, and guess what? This ruptured, and cars were immobile. They were just stuck. People had to get out of their car. They couldn't do anything, right? That's problematic, and I'll let them add more about this in a bit. And again, just another image around CO2 and emission sources during CCS. So if you see this, again, there's gonna be emissions. There's no way to contain it. Leakage, because this stuff is so powerful and potent, it goes through metal pipelines and all that. I've seen it firsthand. I have an uncle that's an inspector of these facilities, and I've been out there with them, and it's like they go and weld these things all the time, and so, so there's no way to contain it. And this is just another image of the CO2 emissions. This is what I was referring to on the Mississippi, that pipeline. I think Monique can talk more about that, or others about what happened that day more about this. But it was like a zombie movie. That's what we learned. It was a zombie movie. Everybody didn't know what to do after that, at that moment. And I want to also talk about hydrogen, because hydrogen is another thing that's being proposed, right? And this is important because hydrogen and its unique values make it more significant, more reactive when compared just to methane. So it's heavier even than methane. And hydrogen is transported in pipeline, even though it's clear and odorless, but when released can burn with a very light blue flame that may not be visible in daylight. It is not unusual for hydrogen releases to explode and then burn. And hydrogen is more reactive than other hazardous hydrocarbons moved in transportation pipelines, such as methane or natural gas. These hydrogen properties make movement by transportation pipeline, whether via gas transmission or gas distribution, more dangerous than conventional natural gas pipelines. Based on hydrogen release events, many with explosions, the following are major points for discussion to help in understanding these important properties. I'm not making this up. There's research behind this. Okay, and this is, shows you here how much more flammable it is compared to natural gas. And you can see, you can take a screenshot of this and you can do your research. There's a reference at the bottom. Actually, you can't really see it. But yeah, it's really more intense than natural gas. And it's a greenhouse gas and 3 times the more warming power than just carbon. This is just an image of a release of a truck transporting hydrogen. That right there is hydrogen being released, okay? And the flammability of that, you might not think, oh, well, just a picture, but guess where those things will be located? Again, in our black and brown communities, right? That's where they'll be located. This is racism. And I want to just talk a little bit about this EJ statement that we put this group here, we're all in Racine, Wisconsin, and put an EJ statement together around the impacts of hydrogen and carbon sequestration. And I do want to get to this slide because when you all look and do hashtag climate justice, really want you to think what climate justice means. Climate justice is not showing up with a poster board or just hashtagging it. Climate justice means these things here. Okay, it doesn't mean you're going to show up at the corner, it's climate change, rally, let's go. This is how this is how you all need to show up and know that these are some of the climate justice principles. These are climate justice principles founded on the environmental justice principles, right? If you can see all of these here, I'm not going to read them. I was going to read them, but I'm not going to read them for the sake of time. But it's important to really hone down on these and understand what this means. Again, workers employed in the extractive fossil fuel industry, right? Making sure they're also protected because they are the same workers that live in the same communities, that are behind the same ones that have the energy burdens. You know, when I talked about earlier about fighting fracking and eminent domain and taking our land, we were fighting that right in our hoods. But there, again, you know, here we are again. That in 10 years, what is the new technology that fossil fuel is going to say? Oh, we got another breakthrough. We're the white saviors. You know, get out of here. You know, we don't need this. And so this is just another of the climate justice principles. If you all want to take a look at it briefly. Oh, wait, something happened here. I had it really highlighted because when we think about the militarization from the fossil fuel industry and thinking about what's going on in the world every day, not just right now and across the globe, the fossil fuel industry is responsible for a lot of all of it, I want to say. And so if you see this, climate justice also opposes military action, occupation, repression, oppression, and exploitation of lands, water, oceans, peoples, and cultures, and other life forms. So these are our climate justice principles. This is what guides our organizing effort. This is what guides our work on the ground. And this is just us way back in the day fighting fracking, right? Stop fracking, and we're organizing. This was at a board of supervisors meeting where they wanted a new rule on land use and eminent domain, and we were there. Guess what? We were there. There was like 5,000 fossil fuel industry, and this is who was there. Fossil fuel industry was in that room. We had to sit in the lobby by the drinking fountains, you know, like way back there by that. You know, and this is the thing, being honest. We have to be honest to ourselves and to everyone here. Otherwise, why am I even speaking here? You know, we need to ensure that our voices are front and center in all policy making, decision making. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Dr. Lam is a public health scientist and works with several environmental justice communities and coalitions. For several years, she has conducted research on the nexus between climate policy, environmental health, and justice. And for the past year, she has focused specifically on carbon capture and sequestration and energy infrastructure. Her presentation today will share analysis of the state of science and policy landscape around the technologies and the implications for environmental health and equity.
Okay, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to talk a bit about CCS and hydrogen and give a little bit of background. So overall, as Beto mentioned, climate mitigation policy has a long history of neglecting equity and justice. And unfortunately, it's been particularly a problem when we're talking about the power sector, the US power sector, and the actions to mitigate their impacts. They have unfortunately ignored the fact that those impacts fall hardest on low-income communities and communities of color. So we've seen the things like market-based mechanisms that basically let you kind of move pollution around without really getting rid of it where it's most needed. We've seen the proliferation of fuels and technology that have very localized impacts. Those impacts are not considered when those fuels and tech are kind of elevated as the way forward. Now we have this new enormous infusion of resources and attention to what is called quote unquote carbon management, which takes the form of carbon capture and sequestration, CCS for short, and hydrogen. So we saw this in the EJA, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021. There was $8.5 billion for various CCS programs. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 extended tax credits for CCS and hydrogen. The bipartisan infrastructure law provided $9.5 billion of funding for hydrogen, including this $8 billion for hydrogen hubs. And we have also seen from the policy side, EPA proposing a power sector GHG rule, elevating hydrogen co-firing and CCS as the best systems of emissions reductions. And so this is why we're here today, and we're here to talk about the environmental health and justice implications of all this carbon management ascendancy. Now, as a bit of background, I think many of you already know this, the co-location of power plants in low-income communities and people of color communities, that's been well documented in the scientific literature. This is the same infrastructure that is going to now host the new CCS and hydrogen projects, which already burden EJ communities. Power plants, this is concerning because power plants, they're not just pumping out the GHGs that drive climate change. You can't just focus on that part. You have to also consider that they're pumping out toxic air pollutants, co-pollutants, that also have harmful health effects. And we see that these harmful health effects are very much disproportionately burdening communities such as these ones here that live around power plants in the state of New Jersey. You do this map for any state, you're going to see the same kind of trend. So what we wanted to do is we really wanted to understand CCS and hydrogen project build out. What are those impacts going to actually look like all along their chain? So from the point of combustion to transport to use and storage, what are these impacts? Because we think these impacts are very likely to occur in already burdened environmental justice communities. So let me give you a brief explanation of CCS to start with. So carbon capture refers to a process where the CO2 is captured and separated at the point of combustion of an emitting source and then transported for use or storage. So it's called CCS for short. Unfortunately, the CCS, or sometimes called CCUS, utilization, the U being for utilization, it doesn't mean that there's a net reduction of carbon dioxide. And in fact, most CO2 today is actually used for enhanced oil recovery, which is what Beto was getting to, EOR, right? Which raises obvious questions about CCS as a climate mitigation strategy and makes it apparent why there are such strong ties between those who support carbon management and the oil and gas industry. Most CCS is not happening at power plants today. It's actually, there's some at industrial facilities, for example, but the proposal is to build out CCS at coal and gas-fired power plants. So as I go through the next few slides on this, what I want to let you guys know is that, yes, there's this new infusion of resources, but there's actually been government support of CCS for quite some time. Even in the 2000s, there was already the tax credits, which have now been expanded. There are actually $4 billion going into demonstration projects for CCS since that same period. So when I tell you, look, like we've found risks, the literature has said that this technology is not efficient and it's risky and it's unproven at scale, that is not for lack of trying. It's not for a lack of investment and research. Okay, so starting with the first step, carbon capture, what we found was that there could be very likely localized environmental health and justice impacts associated with the methods of capturing CO2. And one of the main reasons for this is the energy-intensive nature of the process. There's an energy penalty because it takes energy to do that capture. And there are estimates somewhere between 15 to 44% more energy if you do CCS compared to not doing CCS at all. This more energy obviously means more pollution. And as stated here by the European Energy Administration, these co-pollutants, NOx, PM2.5, and also VOCs, ammonia, et cetera, all of these are going to increase in proportion to the additional fuel that you need to process, to power the CCS process. Another problem is the most common method today for doing carbon capture is through the use of chemical absorption using a chemical that's an amine-based solvent to absorb the CO2 from the flue gas that comes out of burning the fossil fuel. So you're going to get impacts not only because of the energy-intensive nature of this whole operation, but also because of the problem of solvent degradation. So what happens there is you get the formation of nitrosamine when you have the amine solvents and the NOx reacting in the post-combustion flue gas. Nitrosamines are toxic chemicals. They can enter the environment by way of stack emissions or by the disposal of the spent solvents. They're also carcinogenic. They can cause groundwater contamination. They can increase toxicity to aquatic systems. There's been a 2022 review of different substances, because you might think, okay, well, maybe there's research, is there a better solvent? And the thing is, what we found was the 2022 review of carbon capture absorbents noted that across the numerous candidates, the numerous substances that are being tried for chemical absorption, none of them are ready to be deployed at a large scale. The issue is that there's these trade-offs between the chemical properties. So you have things like volatility, toxicity, how energy intensive it is to use that chemical, how much you can kind of regenerate the solvent, and there's these trade-offs between these properties that have not yet been overcome. There are other methods besides absorbents to capture the CO2, but those are actually even farther behind. So it's very problematic when the most researched and deployed method is already generating these kinds of concerns. So kind of the lesson that you're going to see throughout is that if we're just standing here hoping for future advancement in technology to kind of get better, you're basically placing the risks on the same communities, as Beto mentioned, that are already overburdened. So moving on to the issue of transport, what we know is there are studies, literature out there that shows that pipeline infrastructure in this country is disproportionately sited in vulnerable areas. And unfortunately, from what the projections look like, there are many projections. One from Princeton University estimates that if you were to have the level of CO2 pipeline infrastructure necessary for the build-out being proposed, that would be 60,000 plus new miles of CO2 pipelines. So that is more than a 10-fold increase over existing CO2 pipeline infrastructure, and the impacts on communities are going to be extensive and significant. Beto mentioned a bit about the risks of CO2, right? It's an asphyxiant. It can lead to respiratory complications. It can lead to the stalling of vehicles, including emergency response vehicles. It causes health impacts like altered mental state, loss of consciousness, seizures, etc. And all of this is unfortunately not addressed by current regulations. As described by the Pipeline Safety Trust, there's the body that oversees pipelines, which is the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. They've actually made no real progress on pipeline safety in the last decade. They don't actually have specific standards for transporting CO2. Part of this issue is that they actually don't have the knowledge, the research on the safe distance or plume dispersion for developing a potential impact area for CO2 pipelines, which means that you can't actually, if you don't actually know how CO2 is going to disperse, you're not going to be able to establish things like safe distances and integrity management plans and all the things you need to do to protect the people living there. Moving on to carbon storage and sequestration. With respect to CO2 storage, it basically requires a very deep injection well with constant monitoring. And even very rigorous geologic assessment is not enough to mitigate the leakage problems. So much so that you could actually see quite an amount of CO2 escaping through slow, continuous leakage, and it could render your sort of emissions reduction strategy as essentially not a reduction strategy. There are these there's these two projects of offshore CCS of carbon sequestration in Norway that often get pointed to. Even the EPA has pointed to them as like, these are great, these are, proof of concept. Industry points to them. And recent news reported actually problems with both of them. In one of them, they thought that originally the carbon was going to be sequestered for 18 years, turned out to be 2 years. In the other, they suddenly found that the CO2 had actually migrated over 200 meters away from where they put it. So that, again, really raises questions on, where is the science on this stuff right now? I'm not going to get too much into this in terms of the regulatory deficiencies that exacerbate these risks of sequestration, because my colleague Monique will talk about that. But basically, the whole regime of regulation is really questionable when EPA is standing ready to give primacy to states that have very doubtful environmental track records to basically allow them to permit for these Class 6 wells, which are the type of wells that will be storing CO2. And there's also some exceptions that allow Class 2 wells to store CO2 as well, but Class 2 protections are even less than Class 6. So really, if you look at this whole regulatory landscape together, like what you're really looking at is there's going to be very patchwork kind of enforcement and protections, and in many cases, we might see harms occur rather than be prevented. There's also been a lot of attention on hydrogen, and hydrogen is being proposed as a fuel source to blend with natural gas, which would then be co-fired to generate power. So you might have heard this language around quote unquote clean hydrogen. Unfortunately, fossil fuel-based hydrogen actually accounts for 96% of the hydrogen being produced globally right now. And over 90% of hydrogen being produced is actually from natural gas in a process called steam methane reforming. In this process, natural gas gets used as the feedstock and gets converted into hydrogen and CO2 with high temperature and pressure. How are you getting that high temperature and pressure? You're burning more natural gas. So there's natural gas throughout, so it's obviously a very fossil fuel-based process, and it's very energy intensive, and as we know from fossil fuels, this is going to generate a range of co-pollutants. So there's also very questionable benefits from even a climate perspective, because what happens is that there's methane leakage throughout this process. As you might imagine, the name suggests steam methane reforming. They actually, Howarth and Jacobson actually did a 2021 peer-reviewed study which tested kind of a range of assumptions about methane leakage. They also tested a range of assumptions about maybe carbon capture rates that you could get, because the idea of, if you have heard the term blue hydrogen, is that you might have fossil-based hydrogen, but let's apply some CCS to try to capture some of those emissions. And so they said, okay, let's take some of those current capture rates that we're seeing and do some sensitivity analysis, test a range of these things for methane leakage and carbon capture rates. And their finding was robust, and they found that indeed blue hydrogen actually has a large or even larger greenhouse gas footprint than natural gas. There are also air pollutant emissions, VOCs, PM2.5, PM10, NOx, SO2. There's also carbon monoxide. You can see that NOx is a particularly grave concern here. This was from a Sun et al. 2019 study where they looked at GHG emissions and pollutant emissions for hydrogen production nationwide at these facilities that were doing steam methane reforming. Okay, you might have also heard the term green hydrogen, which refers to not fossil-based hydrogen, but hydrogen produced via electrolysis from water instead of from fossil fuels. The problem with this method, what we were finding is that there's a very high freshwater footprint. Sometimes you see this 9 kilograms of water, fresh water, per kilogram of hydrogen. That's actually a significant underestimate. That's basically a theoretical calculation where you're just looking at the chemicals. And if you look at the electrolyzer properties, if you're kind of looking at the whole system, considering even the water inputs to have the energy for this process, you're actually looking at almost an order of magnitude greater. And of course, from an environmental justice and equity point of view, water scarcity is very concerning because it has very life-threatening localized impacts. And then aside from the water footprint, it's also very energy intensive, and it's very expensive, very energy intensive. And it kind of makes sense why this wouldn't be a very efficient process, right? Because if you think about it, if you were to power this with renewables, you're taking those renewables off the grid. And then what are you doing with it? You're using it to make hydrogen to then later burn it so you can make more electricity. Just that doesn't make sense, right? So unfortunately, we can't really endorse this either as something that makes a lot of sense. There's been a lot of attention and language around hydrogen being a clean fuel. You might have said, heard people say, okay, well, if you burn pure hydrogen, then maybe all you get is just water, so it's super clean. But in fact, the proposal is actually that you burn a mixture of hydrogen with natural gas. That's the proposal on the table. And because hydrogen burns at a higher flame point than just natural gas by itself, we're actually looking at increases in NOx emissions when you burn a hydrogen blend. Even this industry magazine here has admitted that you might get actually several hundred parts per million of NOx, which is 3 times higher than burning natural gas alone. So if, that's being admitted there, that it kind of raises serious questions. Unfortunately, there's a lot of energy behind hydrogen hubs right now. I think maybe folks have seen in the news this announcement of 7 hydrogen hubs costing somewhere around $7 billion, potentially going forward across the country. If you look at most of those proposals, most of these hubs actually anticipate that hydrogen will be produced from fossil fuels and or steam methane reforming. You also see that most of these hubs are anticipating that the hydrogen will be used in power generation, so in the way that I just described. Many industry partners are backing the hubs. That are backing the hubs are oil and gas companies. There's also quite a few academic institutions involved, and part of the issue is the funding is coming from oil and gas to a lot of these academic institutions, and it actually has been a struggle, I think, for advocates like us to get the research that is objective, that is actually looking at impacts in a very kind of transparent way. Just wanted to end with just showing a bit of analysis that we did. So we looked at a few different databases on CCS projects in the US power sector that are being proposed right now. We looked at their co-location with environmental justice communities. And you can see the blue dots versus the yellow dots there. Basically, we found that over 90% of those proposed facilities are going to be in environmental justice communities. And these environmental justice communities are already actually burdened. We looked a bit at their EJ screen indicators to get a sense of the environmental burdens, and some 85% of those communities already face heightened environmental stressors. So it is a really worrying landscape, and I think if we were to do the analysis, we're planning to do more analysis on this. I think the trends are probably going to be similar. Here's just some quick conclusions. The main point here is that these risks are being placed on already overburdened communities and will likely contribute to cumulative impacts there. The call I think that we have for the public health community is really to help us be watchdogs on this stuff. It's not just, when you think about climate and health, it's not just how are we reacting to climate change in a way that drives health equity. It's also even the things that you're doing to solve climate change can be very, very bad for health. So that's a bit of why we decided to bring this panel here today. And I'll just close there. If anyone wants more information, a lot of the sources that I mentioned today are cited in this set of comments that we submitted with a coalition of EJ groups to the EPA on their power sector role. Thank you.
Ms. Harden is an attorney with research policy and advocacy experience involving environmental justice, public health, and a wide range of energy projects. She has spearheaded policy recommendations for a governmental task force and academic research pertaining specifically to carbon capture and storage and the inherent risks for community health, as well as environmental and climate conditions. And she's going to talk to us about her work today.
All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Elizabeth, and it's quite an honor to be a part of this panel. Each of the folks you've heard from and will hear from are just tremendous allies in this work for environmental justice. And when we talk about environmental justice, one of the areas that, the way I look at it is this way, that we've got environmental regulations and community health, and there's this vast chasm between the two. And the work of environmental justice is really about closing it in. And I want to just lay out a few things that we're really proud of at the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, focusing in on energy. And a lot of this work came with during the Obama administration with efforts around the Clean Power Plan, the data and the research that showed about 77% of U.S. power plants operate in Black, Latino, Asian, Pacific Islander, indigenous communities across the United States. And in Louisiana, there's now one power plant operating that is, they're all within 1 to 3 miles of a Black community, each and every one of them. And so what are the responses to that? Thankfully, we've got innovation right at our fingertips with renewable energy, where sunshine is power. And what we were able to do with Deep South Center and so many incredible allies on the ground in New Orleans was we formed a coalition called Energy Future New Orleans. So the letters are EFNO. I came up with it because I loved what the acronym would sound like if you pronounced it. And it's really thrilling when you hear like a council member say, Monique Harden with Deep South Center for Environmental Justice and FNO is here to speak. Make my way to the microphone. And the reason why we came up with the coalition was because we had an investor-owned utility company called Entergy that was seeking to build a gas plant that we didn't need in New Orleans, with shifting justifications that we were just shooting one down after the other, and they came up with another justification. And then brought in paid actors to pretend like they were residents in support of the gas plant. And that got some national buzz and attention because it was just such a horrible, corrupting scandal that actually took place, not at one but two council meetings, having paid actors in the room with pro-gas plant Entergy T-shirts and statements that Entergy wrote in scripts that they had to memorize and deliver at the microphones. So while we didn't win the fight against that gas plant, what it did was it created more leverage and momentum for the fight around energy justice. So you're now looking at New Orleans as the first place anywhere in the Southeast region that has a mandatory renewable portfolio standard that requires all electricity supplied in the city to come from renewable and non-carbon sources 100% by the year 2050. This came about because of the work of the AFNO coalition that Deep South Center for Environmental Justice is a part of. If you were to look at a U.S. map of renewable portfolio standards state by state, and you color-coded those states that had voluntary standards and states that had mandatory standards, you would think that the entire Southeast region was not part of the United States because there's no color. So this happened in May 2021, having New Orleans on the map, Southeast region, and we're hoping to grow that to other parts of the region, and working with our friends in Atlanta, Georgia here to move that forward. One of the things that's interesting about New Orleans, we have lots of things that make us interesting, but we also regulate and investor-owned utility at the local level. So the rest of y'all have to do it at your state level through your public utility commissions or public service commissions, but for us it's through our city council. And so with that, we were able to get an ordinance around community solar that we're just finished a round of improvements to make it more marketable for communities across the city to be able to be delivered electricity that is not coming from fossil fuel sources or from Entergy. So it's against that kind of stack of energy wins where we first learned and heard about carbon capture storage. And it really came like that. It was on a governor's climate task force that I was serving on a task force. We got industry folks, you've got environmental justice, you've got public health, you've got government folks, a real wide array of the stakeholders trying to figure out what would be recommendations for Louisiana on climate. And there was a spokesperson for the Gas and Oil Association who wanted to talk about CCS, and this is a public meeting. And so as a member of the panel, I asked him to define what CCS was, and he refused to do it. And that told me, we've got something good here. If they don't want to defend this stuff, maybe we've got a point of attack. And so we began exploring and researching. And the more we explored, the more we found there's nothing to celebrate about CCS. And in a lot of ways, we're looking at a 2.0 version of what we've come out of beginning in the 1950s with the oil and gas development and globally, not just here in the United States, the advent of the Clean Air Act in 1970 and other environmental laws, that what it's gotten us is a real complex, very technical codification of the status quo of industrial operations, and brought to you in the form of Clean Air Act or Clean Water Act, these Orwellian titles we give these statutes that say Louisiana's Cancer Alley, all those facilities were operating in compliance with the Clean Air Act, right? So, and you can look at toxic hotspots in other communities as well. All of those facilities are regulated and pretty much operating in compliance with the Clean Air Act. So what are we getting now, right? We've got climate crisis. So we've gone from nosebleeds that children suffer on the fenceline communities, respiratory problems, cancer, reproductive disorders, you name it, and now we've got this climate crisis. Is that the moment when everyone's going to say, okay, we've got to do the right thing for the environment, for people living on it and all living things? No. What we get instead are false solutions called carbon capture storage, direct air capture. Let's just go with a whole new cadre of boutique gases that you can't see when they're burning, so you can walk right into it and set yourself on fire, like hydrogen. Let's do that stuff instead of cutting this coal, this oil, this gas off. And we're here to just expose that so that we're really clear about it, because we can get so caught up in the technical language and the words which are really there to make you feel disempowered And I really want to make you feel very empowered to talk about it and talk about the change that's needed, which is a renewable energy economy that's equitable, that puts communities first, that puts workers first, that moves us in a just transition. Okay, so what is CCS and why should I be concerned? Some of this we've gone over, but I just want to lay out that with carbon capture and storage in particular, which is what CCS stands for, that was whispered by that guy from the Gas and Oil Association, it's a very risky industrial process, and it's targeting communities that have the least amount of power to fight back against it. You don't see CCS being talked about coming to Manhattan or Beverly Hills. It's places in Louisiana that you've never heard of, like Darrow, Louisiana. I think it's really important basics when we're talking about carbon dioxide or CO2 to understand that this is some hazardous stuff. We know it mostly because it traps heat on the planet when it's released into the atmosphere. It doesn't end there. It can also, as was discussed earlier, displaces oxygen in the air. We need that oxygen to breathe. Many of us are on fuel ICE vehicles. You can't operate a car or a truck or an emergency vehicle to get to a community if that stuff is in the air. Because those cars, the vehicles need the oxygen. It's an asphyxiant, so because it's displacing the air, it's choking you. It can cause death. It can cause brain damage. It can cause other disorders, respiratory arrest from exposure to it. It's corrosive, highly corrosive. It can break down metals. And then underground, we know that it can break down rock formations. How do we know that? Because oil companies are profiting from that particular property of carbon dioxide, because it's able to break down the rock to get at the gas, the oil that's trapped underground, that they can then siphon up and sell. So we know it can break down rock formations. What does that mean if you have a fault line? Okay? And what does that mean if you have underground sources of drinking water? This stuff can contaminate your drinking water source. And then earthquakes would be the result of triggering a fault line. So as Yukon said, and I just put here, is that we're talking about a three-step process with carbon capture and storage. There's the capture, where you're basically trying to move the carbon dioxide that's in the industrial waste gas away from the smokestack. So as it's moving out of these various units of production and on its way to the storage, to the smokestack, there's this intervention that happens where the carbon, come over here, carbon dioxide. And it's just the carbon dioxide. There's nothing else that's coming with it in that waste gas. But the process for doing this, as Yukian said, it's not developed, and it's certainly not regulated. So communities on the fenceline have that extra level of risk. The transportation of CO2, it has to be put into this hypercritical state where it's not a gas anymore, but it's also not a liquid. It's a real interesting kind of physics, but that's what's needed in order to make it travel through pipe. You might be wondering, well, why not train? There are actually rules and laws that say not by train, it's too dangerous. It has smaller quantities are allowed. But the millions and millions and millions of tons of this stuff, companies are seeking to put through pipeline, where we know it's corrosive, that makes it a hazard. It can break down the metal fabrications in those pipelines. And then the injection underground. Notice that we always have to show you drawings. One thing that's important to say is that none of this carbon capture storage stuff is like a McDonald's. You know, you can go to it, you can walk up to the door, you can order a hamburger. You can't go to a carbon capture storage facility. They're all proposed, they're all in design phases, but they're all getting, just the ideas are enough to get huge tax credits. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But so we have drawings about what it should be and what it will do. But what we know for a fact is that carbon dioxide is mobile. It moves upward, as we know, because it goes into the atmosphere when it's released. And so what would that look like in a place like Louisiana or Ohio or West Virginia, where there's lots of wells underground? Each well, whether you know it's there or not, and we have a lot that are not recorded, we have a lot that are not plugged. We have some that are plugged, but of course plugging, like any man-made thing or human-made thing, it wears down over time. Each of those wells can serve like a straw for that carbon dioxide. So what are we doing this for? The whole point was to keep it out of the atmosphere, and we've got a process where this could still happen because it won't be managed. I'll stop there. So we talked about the industrial, we talked about the pipeline. I just want to spend a little bit of time on the pipeline leak and rupture. You know, climate change had a lot to do with this rupture that took place in Satarsha, Mississippi. This rupture occurred on a carbon dioxide pipeline that was being used or transported for enhanced oil recovery. So the carbon dioxide would be used to break down the rocks underground, get at the oil, the gas that the Denbury company would be transporting to other oil and gas companies for that purpose. And as it was making its way through Mississippi, there was huge rain events, so much so that it caused the ground to get super wet and fall away. So that pipeline that's supposed to be balanced on solid ground ain't. And so you've got this tilt and rupture. And so the carbon dioxide comes out as a matter of that. And because it's still a super wet, heavy moisture time period when that happens, that carbon dioxide forms clouds and just hangs in the air. So people begin passing out. Folks are not answering cell phones. Emergency response is able to get, and when they get to the air, they see cars with the taillights on, but they're not moving, some with doors open. People passed out inside. And they then went to the Denbury company and said, have you noticed anything weird about your pipeline? Oh, there was a drop in pressure. We probably should have called you several hours ago about that. So people are still dealing with neurological problems, disabilities, because of that long period of exposure to carbon dioxide. And so when pipelines are being planned or developed, they're not thinking about weather conditions, they're not thinking about land formation, surface, any of that. For risks underground, we talked a little bit about existing wells in Louisiana. That's not Louisiana with acne or chickenpox. Those red dots are representing a well that's known and recorded. And so, we're calling it a between the toes strategy that some of the companies have for where they want to build out new wells for carbon dioxide injection. And so you can see where the spaces are, and I hope you understand the reference to between the toes. But, so where can they go for these wells when you've got so much of the state covered with wells that are operating or have been dug underground? The area above, the image above is an area that right now has federal and state resources and multi-million-dollar budgets to stabilize the ground from previous industrial operations. And it's in this area that another carbon capture storage facility is proposed. And with all of this stuff that's underground, the main problem or issue is that contamination of drinking water. So what's driving it? We've got changes that Congress has made to the IRS tax code called Section 45Q, and it now provides $85 for every metric ton of carbon dioxide you want to put underground. I know. And Exxon and other companies aren't proposing anything less than 5 million ton projects for carbon disposal. So that's $500 million per project that we pay for, not their capitalist-loving, risk-taking shareholders, taxpayers. And then, if that's not enough, we've got more taxpayer dollars going to the Department of Energy to do what? Give them the gift of grants for trying it out, whether it's hydrogen hubs at $7 billion or more money for different carbon capture storage demonstration projects. Right now, in case you think that this is just a Louisiana problem, I'm here to tell you that it ain't. This is a map of the United States, and it shows that as of November 9th of this year, these are the permits that EPA is now reviewing where companies want to bring a carbon capture storage well. So for California, we're talking right now, there's applications for 47 wells. Louisiana, of course, we outdo it by 54. Texas has 19, Indiana 4. New Mexico has 1. Osage Nation in Oklahoma 2. Arkansas 1, Kansas 1, Ohio 1, Illinois 22. And it goes on. EPA, according to its information on the permit trackers, is estimating about a 2-year period of review for each permit application. One of the things that makes this really frustrating is that we're talking about risk sort of like, you know that riddle, if a tree falls in a forest, no one's there, did it make a sound? Well, the question here is, if carbon dioxide as a hazardous material is waived from hazardous regulations for hazard materials, is it still a hazard? And what EPA did in 2014 was waived federal regulations that would govern the storage, transportation, like via pipeline, and disposal of carbon dioxide as a hazardous material. And they waived it. And we sent a Freedom of Information Act request from Deep South Center to EPA wanting to know, was this based on any scientific analysis? And after 2 months of conversations, we finally got a written response that says, no, it wasn't. And so it's based on this presumption that other regulations will kick in and take care of what the federal regulations on hazard materials require. So as you just heard, out of the Department of Transportation, the Pipeline Hazard Materials and Safety Administration is like, oh no, when it comes to carbon dioxide pipeline. There's no regulation for capturing it from a facility. And we're going to get into, well, what are the regulations for the underground storage? I'm going to show you that in a minute. But it's based on this presumption, and it's not unlike other presumptions that operate within the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, which is if a permit is issued, as long as a company can show in its application that it will do basically the bare minimum that other companies in the same industrial sector do, right? And so when communities complain that this is not enough, it's going to cause health problems and other hazards, they get back a response from their state environmental agencies, all with EPA's approval and oversight, that says, you know, dear citizen, thank you for your comment letter, but because this facility or this applicant meets those bare bone, industry-driven requirements, it is presumptively protective of human health and the environment. And so this is the presumption for the waivers, that we don't need this federal regulation that operates under a law called the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, also known as RCRA, RCRA, because there are other things out there that'll make it okay. Well, one of the things we have is the law and regulations for protecting underground sources of drinking water. And if carbon dioxide was treated like the hazard material that it is before the waiver took place, it would have to meet the requirements that are there for what's called Class 1 wells, which is for hazardous materials or hazardous waste. Instead, what EPA has done is developed a whole new category of class called now the Class 6 well, which is for carbon dioxide injection. And I'm just giving you one flavor because there's siting, there's well construction, there are other requirements, but just on the siting, none of these things are required to make this stuff safer for communities and safe drinking water sources. This is the kind of stuff we deal with in environmental justice, is seeing that there's, you know, you think once you get to understand this Clean Air Act or this Safe Drinking Water Act, you'll get the protection you need, and you realize there's nothing there. So soon after the Biden-Harris administration took office, they established a White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. They came up with a very nifty, wonderful idea that 40% of federal dollars should be dedicated to improving communities that are disadvantaged, and they charged the council with giving recommendations on how those dollars should be directed. And guess what this council said? None of those dollars should go to carbon capture storage or CCUS or any of that other carbon management junk. In New Orleans and Livingston Parish, we were the first to put out official governmental moratoriums and prohibitions against CCS build-outs. We're suggesting that, you know, folks might want to consider that in your local county, state governments as well, because we know that we don't have the federal environmental protection. This was the climate task force where the word CCS were whispered. This is what we wound up coming up with, notwithstanding the fulsome participation of industry associates and members. And this is on the section that deals with carbon capture storage. That one, it involves technology that can negatively impact communities, ecosystems, and cultural resources. This is almost like a direct grab from the plan. And therefore, it should require a new regulatory and legal framework, meaning that what we've got in existence doesn't work, is not fit and up for the job. And that there should be further assessment to fully understand the impacts of all of this. Our state of Louisiana is seeking primacy, which means the ability to permit carbon dioxide waste injection in the state after a repeated history and pattern of abusing the environment and communities in the state of Louisiana. One community no longer exists because of Louisiana's failure to operate and regulate wells and cavern activities. The ground just collapsed and the Bayou Corn community no longer is there. And now we're looking at more recently in September an emergency order that was called by the governor because we have another salt cavern that looks like it's in the same position. So, you know, like I began in the beginning, CCS supports the continued burning of coal, oil, and gas. And more importantly, it sets back the work that groups like Deep South Center and others that are here represented on this panel and in the audience and around this country have been doing to really make that transition towards an equitable, renewable energy economy. So here's a quiz. I hope you all will participate. I've just got one question. So it's a pass-fail, okay? So what is carbon capture and storage? Is it a way for corporate polluters to continue burning coal, oil, and gas? Is it an industrial process that fails to mitigate climate change? Is it a major federal tax credit of billions of dollars to the coal, oil, and gas industry? Is it a major health, environmental, and safety risk for communities? Or is it all of the above? You guys, okay, you passed. And that's how you can get in touch with me. Thank you.
Sheets was a founding member of the New Jersey EJ Alliance, the EJ Leadership Forum, EJ and Science Initiative, and an informal New England Environmental Justice Attorney Group. He was appointed to the New Jersey Clean Air Council, EPA's Clean Air Act Advisory Committee, and National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and was co-author of the Human Health chapter for the 2014 National Climate Assessment. He's currently serving on the White House EJ Advisory Council. Earlier in his career, he practiced law as a public interest attorney. He holds a BA in economics from Princeton and earned a PhD in earth and planetary sciences and JD and MPP from Harvard University. Sheets also took science courses as a post-bac student at City College of New York. And his presentation today will focus on a discussion of climate change mitigation policy from an environmental justice perspective.
So, thanks for hanging in there with us. You've heard some very good speakers and we've given you a lot of information. You've heard a lot about what we don't like. You've heard some of what we do like too. I didn't know about the legislation in New Orleans, by the way. Yeah, that's great. And I'm going to focus more on what we want. Climate change mitigation policy that the EJ community has been talking about for years, especially the EJ community in New Jersey. For short, it's come to be called mandatory emissions reduction, but it is climate change mitigation policy from the EJ perspective. And I'm going to start by giving you the motivation for the policy. And here are figures I've shown to many audiences all over the country. It was really put together by, not really, it was actually put together by New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. I think that's important, not by us crazy EJ folk. They put together in 2009, and they were asking the question, what's the relationship between race, poverty, and pollution in New Jersey. So the first thing they did was they assigned a cumulative impact score to every neighborhood in New Jersey. For the purposes of these figures and for what we're talking about now, you can think of cumulative impacts as a very rough estimate of the total amount of pollution in a New Jersey neighborhood. And then to figure out the relationship between the total amount of pollution in New Jersey neighborhoods and race and poverty, they graphed those cumulative impact scores against race and poverty, and look what they found. Look at what I call this unfortunate relationships that they found. Look at the top figure, and you'll see that as the number of people of color living in New Jersey neighborhoods increases, so does the estimate of the total amount of pollution. And it's the same thing for people living in poverty in New Jersey. As the number of people living in poverty increases in a neighborhood, so is the estimate of the amount of pollution. So I'll say what I've said maybe, I don't know, hundreds of times, but every time I say it, it starts making me angry. What this is providing you evidence of is that if you live in New Jersey, the amount of pollution in your neighborhood is connected to race and income, the color of your skin, and the amount of money in your pocket. And you've heard that said in different versions by all the panelists. And this goes against everything that the country and the state at least claim that they stand for. And let me say a couple more things about this. This is not unique to New Jersey, as we've heard from Louisiana, from across the country. If other states did similar studies, some of them, probably many of them, would have similar findings. And in fact, one of the things that started the EJ movement were national studies that had similar findings. And why are we worried about this? Well, we're worried about this disproportionate pollution load in EJ communities. When I say EJ communities, they're the communities on the right of your screen, low-income communities, communities with low income, and communities of color. We're worried about this because we know that this is one cause, not the only cause, but one cause of persistent, here, American Public Health Association, this is one cause of persistent health disparities that exist in our country that are rooted in race and income. So when we look at this, and we would have all predicted this, right? And so when we saw this in New Jersey, we said, okay, we got to do something about this. And by the way, this is a whole other cumulative impacts, a whole other presentation that I give, because we recently adopted in New Jersey what was arguably at the time the strongest EJ law, the only law based on only law that said that you must turn down applications for pollution permits under some circumstances based on race and income. But I'm not going to get into the details of that. I'm using it here to motivate the climate change mitigation policy I want to talk about. Because when we saw this, well, what I want to argue to you based on this is that there are at least two types of policies that you can develop to address cumulative impacts, disproportionate pollution loads in environmental justice communities. One of them is by using the concept of cumulative impacts itself. And that's what the New Jersey law does. Right? It uses cumulative impacts, the idea of cumulative impacts to address cumulative impacts. Makes sense, right? But another type of law are laws that address the different types of pollution that go into making up this disproportionate pollution load. And so we've been advocating that one type of law that should be used to address disproportionate pollution in EJ communities is climate change mitigation law. So let's talk about that. So remember, classically what you want from climate change mitigation policy is you wanted to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, usually carbon dioxide, to fight climate change. And we want that too. We want to make that clear. We want to fight climate change, because right? it hits our communities that we say first and worst. But what we also want from climate change mitigation policy is not only for it to fight climate change, but also to address the local pollution that is killing our folks and making our folks sick in disproportionate numbers in EJ communities now. We want to address both problems. And that was kind of the basic premise of what we want from climate change mitigation policy from the EJ perspective. Here's a more detailed premise. And this is really the guts. If we get through this, then you know everything you need to know. We'll let you go back out into the world. But let's go, and I'll take you through this kind of line by line to say, hey, this is what we want from climate change mitigation policy from an EJ perspective. The first thing you see, it says guaranteed emissions reductions. Now, you may think, well, why are we even saying that? Because isn't climate change mitigation policy all about getting emissions reductions? Well, it is, but it depends on what type of policy you're talking about. And Beto talked about carbon trading, market-based mechanisms. That's when we first put this policy together. And so under some policies, you will not necessarily get emissions reductions from all power plants. So we're talking about the power sector, right? We've all been talking about that. We're talking about the power sector. You won't necessarily get reductions from all power plants at all locations. And what we really want from the climate change mitigation policy, again, is we want to get emissions reductions in and near EJ communities, preferably by just closing the plants in EJ communities. Just close them down. There might be political problems with that, though, right? You might not be able to do it. So then the next best thing, go down to intentionally maximizing. The next best thing would be to say, okay, we're going to create a policy that hits your carbon dioxide reduction goal, but while you're doing it, it's going to maximize reductions of co-pollutants. So let's talk about this, because you've heard that word a couple of times now. You know about greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, right? And a lot of times, well, maybe not a lot of times, but you've probably heard carbon dioxide called a global pollutant. So the idea is to fight climate change, it doesn't matter where you reduce it. If you reduce it in Louisiana, it's the same as reducing it in New Jersey. But the greenhouse gas co-pollutants are different. Now remember, a power plant will emit carbon dioxide, but it emits these other pollutants along with the carbon dioxide. And in the vernacular climate change mitigation policy, they're called co-pollutants. And these co-pollutants, one thing I didn't say about carbon dioxide, remember the carbon dioxide doesn't hurt you directly, at least not when you're outside. It hurts you by causing climate change. But the co-pollutants do hurt you directly, right? They have locally detrimental impacts. Remember I said the carbon dioxide doesn't matter where you reduce it, it matters where you reduce these co-pollutants. And we're talking about things like PM2.5, you've heard them, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides. And they make up part of that pollution load, that disproportionate pollution load you saw depicted in the figures that I show. So we really want climate change mitigation policy not only to fight climate change, but to reduce these locally harmful co-pollutants. And by reducing them, right, we're going to improve the health of our communities. Well, there is some climate change mitigation policy out there, but none of them maximize co-pollutant reduction. None of them even require co-pollutant reduction. So that's the next policy. That if we can't get a policy that maximizes co-pollutant reduction, requires it, maximizes it, we'll take a policy just requiring co-pollutant reduction. If we can't get that, because remember, no policy does that, we'll take a policy that requires carbon dioxide emissions reductions from plants located in EJ communities. Because if we get that policy, we're going to get some co-pollutant reduction. Because there's generally a correlation between the carbon dioxide emissions and the co-pollutant emissions. So you reduce the carbon dioxide, you're going to reduce the co-pollutants, and you're going to improve the health of communities. So for a long time, that was our policy. We were dealing with carbon trading. Carbon trading doesn't, mandate reduction at any one point. So we said, okay, no matter what the policy, let's force these plants to reduce carbon dioxide emissions in EJ communities. Okay, now there's a caveat though. You've heard about the CCS and you've heard about the hydrogen co-firing. So this policy doesn't work if you're using CCS or hydrogen co-firing. Why? Because both of those, I think I have a slide. Both of those, and you've heard about the problems with these already, right? Both of those methodologies, they fracture the relationship between carbon dioxide emissions and co-pollutant emissions. They're no longer correlated because now you can reduce carbon dioxide without reducing the coal pollutant emissions. In fact, not only do these methodologies fracture that relationship and not guarantee the coal pollutant emissions reductions, but as you've heard already, there's a good chance that they will actually increase the coal pollutant emissions. So that's another reason, right, from our perspective, we've been talking about this for years, that we don't want CCS in hydrogen co-firing. So what do we want? Well, you've heard it already. I'm just going to add an additional factor here. We want a rapid transition to renewable energy and energy efficiency. Right? Once you get from a fossil-based fuel-based energy system to one based on renewable energy and energy efficiency, you're not going to have the coal pollutant emissions. And so you're going to improve, not only are you going to fight climate change, but you're going to improve the health of communities, especially environmental justice communities. But how long is that going to take? $60 million question. From that, while we have that transition from the fossil fuel-based economy, energy system to an energy system based on renewable energy, energy efficiency, and I'm being optimistic here, what we're advocating is that you use the mandatory emissions reduction policy, right, to ensure that you get emissions reductions in EJ communities while we're making that transition. Now, I should stop there, but let me take one more minute and say this, because I was sitting listening to all my colleagues. I get excited when they talk, and I'm scribbling notes, and I actually wrote a whole, like a different talk, but I couldn't give it because I promised I was going to give this one. But you know, let me just say a couple of things. One thing I want to say is that, I've said this already. We want to fight climate change, right? And we want to win the fight. But we don't want to sacrifice our communities while we're fighting climate change. Right? And you've heard people say it. From an EJ perspective, it doesn't make sense to add risk to communities that are already at high risk. And I just want to remind you that if you're killed by the local air pollution or you're made sick, you have COPD, once we win the fight against climate change, again, I'm being optimistic, if you were killed, you're not going to be resurrected. If you're sick, you're probably not going to be cured. So the question comes, who are we saving the planet for? And even if, and this really drives me a little bit crazy, even if CCS and hydrogen co-firing work, say they work as they're intended, our communities could still be harmed. A good chance it still won't work for our communities. So again, it's almost as if this well, I'm old, I'll say it anyway. It's almost as if this is designed to save the world, but not save our communities. Or at least that becomes, let me say it in a different way, that becomes acceptable. And you can say, we're here at the APHA, and you said, well, we want you to be watchdogs. This is public health, right? APHA should be watchdogs. Well, we want you at least to do that. We really need you to do more. Because the fight for this is going to be at the state level. We can stop this at the state level, but we need help. We need people to take the stand against this stuff with us. And we worked on the rule all summer. We worked on writing comments for the rule. And before we read the rule, we kind of knew what was in it. We were not going to oppose it. We were going to analyze the rule, point out how it works, some problems with it, and then take the fight to the state level. But when we read the rule, and at the urging of Monique, Monique and I had this discussion, we decided we couldn't not oppose it. It didn't make sense, that we would have to do backflips not to oppose it, right? And look, Beto said this, right? Climate justice, environmental justice is not just going to rallies. Sometimes it's taking hard stands. You're taking stands that people will talk stuff about you for, right? You're taking stands that will cost you money. But we need allies now, and we need you and the APHA to take this stand with us. So, thanks for coming. We hope to see you again, and we hope you'll be allies in this fight for us. If you will, I'd like this picture here. If you will, you see the picture of the little girl? She's from the EJ community. You'll make her a lot happier than she looks in that picture.